Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever looked into the eyes of a child whose home was blown to dust by a weapon built thousands of miles away? Have you ever wondered how a peaceful city, a village, a neighborhood becomes a war zone overnight? It's not just politics, it's not just policy, it's a system, a cycle. And behind it all is the truth no one wants to talk about. The truth behind US arms in the Middle East. This isn't just about tanks and bombs. It's about power, profit, and people caught in the crossfire. Let's unpack this piece by piece. When we talk about war in the Middle East, the conversation is often framed in political jargon or military strategy. We hear about airstrikes, ceasefires, foreign policy, alliances, and national interests. But what's lost in all of that is the people, the actual human beings who live under the shadow of these policies and weapons. The families who have to decide between running or dying. The parents who send their children to bed in bomb shelters, not bedrooms. The children who wake up to the sound of drones instead of birds. It's not just a war zone, it's their home, their memories, their entire world turned into rubble. There's a dangerous numbness that comes with repetition. We've seen so many headlines: missile strikes Gaza, explosion kills civilians in Yemen, drone attack in Syria, that our hearts stop reacting. We've grown used to tragedy, but just because the world has become numb doesn't mean the pain has disappeared. It's real, it's constant, and it's being felt by people who did not choose this. Weapons don't fall from the sky on their own. Someone sends them. Someone makes them. Someone profits from them. And when the fragments of those weapons are found in destroyed homes, they often carry markings that trace back to factories in the United States. Behind each of those serial numbers is a company, a contract, a profit margin, and a child who will never grow up. That's not just collateral damage. That's a life ended before it even began. You won't see it on the nightly news, but there are mothers right now holding lifeless babies in makeshift hospitals because the airstrike missed its intended target. There are fathers who dig through rubble with their bare hands, hoping to find a heartbeat beneath the concrete. Imagine being that parent. Imagine that being your child, your neighborhood, your future obliterated in seconds because of a geopolitical calculation that had nothing to do with you. That's the real cost. It's not just bodies, it's dreams, hopes, relationships, birthdays, graduations stolen by war. And yet somehow it continues again and again. New weapons, new funding, new deals. While the same people keep losing everything. It's not always about oil. It's not always about terrorism. Sometimes it's just about the machine. The war machine that needs to keep turning to stay alive. And in that machinery, the value of human life becomes a number, a statistic, a justification. But to the people living it, it's devastation. It's trauma that lives in their bones. It's the sound of a jet overhead that sends children diving under tables. It's the fear of stepping outside and not coming back. Think about how a child in the Middle East views the sky, not as a place of wonder or beauty, but as a source of threat. That's what this endless conflict has done. It's rewired the way generations experience life. Children are growing up with PTSD before they even know how to spell it. Families teach each other how to survive air raids instead of how to thrive in peace. People build lives in the cracks between attacks. They don't get to dream about careers or vacations. They're just trying to stay alive long enough to raise their children. And the weight of all this often lands in the most fragile hands. The innocent, the people who never picked up a weapon, never voted in a war-hungry politician, never signed a deal for missiles. They are the ones who carry the cost. That's the injustice we rarely speak of. The fact that decisions made in boardrooms and parliaments end up extinguishing lives in places most of us can't even pronounce. But it should matter, because we are all connected, and because the weapons used in those wars often come from nations that claim to stand for freedom, peace, and democracy. How can we claim to value life yet export tools of death to places already on fire? How can we talk about liberty while fueling destruction for profit? It's time we humanize this issue. Strip away the politics, the party lines, the distractions. Look at the people. Look at the pain. Understand that behind every explosion is a story that never got to finish, a wedding that never happened, a father that never came home, a child that never got to start school. And those stories matter just as much as ours. They're not less important because they speak another language or live in another land. They are just as human, just as deserving of safety, dignity, and peace. We can't change the past, but we can open our eyes to the present. We can choose to care. We can raise our voices. We can demand that our governments rethink what they export and who they arm. Because until we do, This cycle will continue, and the price will always be paid by the people least responsible. No more silence, no more indifference. We owe it to the people whose lives have been shattered by decisions made in their absence. This isn't just about war. It's about humanity. It's about conscience. It's about choosing to see the full picture and not turning away when it gets uncomfortable. Because discomfort is a small price to pay when others are paying with their lives. To understand how we arrived at this painful reality in the Middle East, we must go back decades back. This didn't begin with one war or one administration. This is the result of choices made over time, woven together like threads in a dark tapestry. The history of US arms deals in the Middle East is not just a story of military supply lines. It's a story of ambition, fear, power, and ultimately unintended devastation. After World War II, the United States emerged as a superpower, but it wasn't just about territory or ideology. It was about influence. And influence in the Middle East meant something very specific: access. Access to oil, access to trade routes, and access to a region where alliances could either stabilize the world or ignite it. With the Cold War heating up, the US looked at the Middle East as a chessboard, not a community. And the way to win was to arm friends faster than the enemy could. The first major arms relationship started with countries like Iran under the Shah. Billions of dollars in weapons poured in. Fighter jets, tanks, missiles, all designed to create a regional strongman who could counter Soviet influence. But those weapons didn't disappear when the Shah fell. When the Iranian Revolution exploded, the same American weapons were now in the hands of a government deeply hostile to the United States. That wasn't just an irony, it was the start of a dangerous pattern. Then came Iraq, once an ally, then an adversary, then an uneasy partner, and eventually a battlefield. In the 1980s, during the brutal Iran-Iraq War, the US quietly supported Saddam Hussein's regime with intelligence and supplies, even though his regime was using chemical weapons. Weapons and support were sent not because he was a moral leader, but because he wasn't Iran. That's the cold truth. These arms weren't always about defense or security. They were tools of influence, of leverage, of temporary advantage. As the years passed, the relationships grew deeper and more dangerous. The US began supplying Israel with advanced weapons systems to ensure what was called a qualitative military edge. Billions in military aid, high-tech fighter jets, missile systems, and precision-guided bombs. It was a partnership meant to provide stability, but it also meant that any military conflict involving Israel would now involve American technology. That would come into play in every skirmish, every war, every flare-up that followed. Then came Saudi Arabia, an oil-rich monarchy strategically positioned, economically powerful, and politically important. The US signed one arms deal after another, decade after decade. Advanced aircraft, missile defense systems, guided bombs, surveillance tech, all sold in staggering quantities. In many cases, these deals were signed despite serious concerns about human rights abuses or internal repression. Why? Because the Saudis were allies, because they bought in bulk, because their role in stabilizing oil prices mattered to American markets. But there's a cost to arming regimes without accountability. In Yemen, a devastating civil war has become one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, and many of the airstrikes that have destroyed schools, hospitals, and homes were carried out using American-made weapons. These are not distant policies, these are real consequences. The bombs dropped don't just carry payloads, they carry the weight of moral responsibility. Throughout this timeline, the rationale was always dressed in the language of security. We're maintaining balance. We're protecting allies. We're countering terrorism. But underneath that language was a strategy: if we arm our friends, we keep the region within our orbit. But what happens when those friends change? What happens when regimes fall and chaos takes their place? The weapons remain, and sometimes they change hands. American rifles once given to Iraqi security forces ended up in the hands of ISIS fighters. Black market deals, battlefield looting, broken alliances. These all become pipelines for US weapons to end up in unintended hands. This history is not just one of mistakes, it's one of repetition. Again and again, arms deals were signed with promises of stability. But again and again, the result has been more destruction, more displacement, more death. It's not a history of isolated incidents. It's a systemic issue, and the people who suffer are rarely the decision makers. They are the civilians caught between rival powers, the refugees fleeing cities reduced to dust, the children growing up in the shadow of war machines made on another continent. And yet the cycle continues. Every administration inherits it. Some expand it. Some promise reform but deliver more of the same. The US Defense industry continues to lobby for deals to fund political campaigns, to push narratives of threat and security that justify more arms, more contracts, more shipments. Meanwhile, the legacy of these weapons is being written in the blood of innocent people in places like Gaza, Aleppo, Sanaa, and Mosul. It's easy to talk about history like it's a textbook, but this isn't academic. This is a trail of choices, real choices, that led to real suffering. This is a history written not just in documents and diplomatic cables, but in funerals, in refugee camps, in the shattered remains of homes. If we want to change the future, we can't ignore the past. We have to confront it, learn from it, and stop pretending that these deals come without a cost. Because the truth is, we've been paying it. We just haven't been the ones paying with our lives. In international politics, words like diplomacy, peacekeeping, and strategy are used like shields. They sound noble, purposeful, and civil. But behind those words often lie deals forged not in the name of peace, but in the quiet hunger for power. One of the most powerful and dangerous tools in the foreign policy arsenal is the distribution of weapons, not to defend, but to control, to influence, to shape the behavior of other nations, not with goodwill, but with the threat of firepower. This is the uncomfortable reality most people never see. When a country like the United States supplies weapons to another nation, it's not always because that country needs protection. Often it's because that country's allegiance, cooperation, and obedience are seen as useful. Weapons become leverage, they become bargaining chips, and the result is a dangerous dynamic where peace is never the goal, balance of power is. It's a game of chess where human lives are the pawns. Arming a government means placing a leash on it. When one country provides the tools to wage war or crush rebellion or flex military might, it also gains influence over that government's future. Suddenly, the recipient becomes dependent not just on the equipment, but on the spare parts, the training, the upgrades, the intelligence support. That dependency is exactly what policymakers want, because it means decisions are no longer entirely sovereign, they're shaped by the needs and expectations of the supplier. But here's the painful part: this strategy doesn't promote peace. It promotes tension. Because when one country receives weapons, its rival reacts. And then more weapons are sent to the rival to maintain balance. Before long, both sides are armed to the teeth, not to prevent war, but to make sure if war happens, each side can inflict as much damage as possible. And often that war does happen, and the weapons don't disappear after they're used. They stay, they circulate. They change hands. They become the fuel for future violence. In the Middle East, this pattern has repeated so many times it almost seems routine. Country A gets missiles. Country B gets jets. Country C gets funding. Country D gets drones. And all of it under the umbrella of security and partnership. But what kind of security is this? Where every side is more afraid than before. Where every population lives under threat of attack. Where young men are trained to fight before they ever get the chance to learn how to live. It's important to realize that this kind of policy isn't just about defense. It's about control. It's about making sure certain governments stay in power, certain alliances remain intact, certain outcomes are guaranteed. And when those outcomes start to shift, when a government starts to act independently, or speak against its patron, or lean toward a different global power, those same weapons can become pressure points. Support can be pulled. Spare parts can be denied. Threats can be made. Military dependence becomes political vulnerability. And it's not just the leaders who suffer, it's the people. Because weapons don't sit quietly in warehouses forever. They get used. And when they do, it's usually not against some theoretical foreign enemy. It's against someone's village, someone's home, someone's child. The truth is, many of the conflicts raging in the Middle East right now are not happening in spite of foreign arms supplies. They are happening because of them. When two factions are equally armed by outside powers, violence becomes inevitable. Dialogue becomes irrelevant. Diplomacy loses meaning. And it is always the civilians who are crushed between the ambitions of men in suits and generals behind screens. Children born into war don't know who made the decisions that led to their pain. All they know is the sound of bombs, the silence after an airstrike, the way their mother cries at night, the way their father stares blankly at rubble, wondering what's left to protect. What makes this even more heartbreaking is the hypocrisy. Countries that claim to stand for peace are the very ones arming both sides, condemning violence while fueling it, speaking of human rights while selling to regimes that silence dissent with brutality. And the justification, it's always the same: stability, balance, influence. But if stability requires endless war, what kind of stability is that? and who really benefits. The truth is, weapons are not just tools of war, they are instruments of politics. They allow governments to say one thing and do another. They make peace seem like an option, but never a priority. And while billions are spent on weapons and defense contracts, entire generations are raised in the shadow of destruction. We are told that weapons bring peace, that arming allies deters conflict. But history tells another story. History shows us that the more we arm, the more we destabilize. That influence gained through fear is never real, and that control maintained through violence is never permanent. What endures is suffering. What remains is trauma. What grows is hatred. Until we stop seeing arms as mere tools of strategy and start seeing them for what they really are, devices of death, we will continue to repeat the same cycle. A cycle not of security, but of control through chaos. And in that chaos, it's never the powerful who pay the price. It's the innocent. It's the forgotten. It's the people whose names we'll never know, whose stories will never be told, but whose lives were forever shaped by a weapon made, sold, and sent in the name of control. When war breaks out in any part of the world, our instinct is to think of the destruction, the bombs, the blood, the broken families. But behind the chaos, behind the headlines and televised horror, there's another story unfolding. A quieter one that doesn't show up in front-line photos or survivor testimonies. It's the story of profit, the economics of war, the billions that are made while millions suffer. Because where there's conflict, there's always someone cashing in. War is a business. Not just in theory, but in cold financial reality. Every tank that rolls through a ruined street, every missile that strikes a neighborhood, every drone that flies above a war-torn village. Those are all products. Manufactured, contracted, shipped, and paid for. There's a supply chain behind every explosion. There's a boardroom conversation behind every arms deal. And for every civilian buried under rubble, there's someone whose stock price just went up. In the United States, the defense industry is one of the most powerful forces in both business and politics. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, and Northrop Grumman don't just build weapons, they build influence. They fund think tanks, sponsor political campaigns, and spend millions lobbying lawmakers to ensure that the money keeps flowing. And that money is not just a little, it's massive. The Pentagon's budget is higher than the next several nations combined. Hundreds of billions every year, much of it spent on weapons contracts and foreign arms sales. And where do many of those weapons end up? In the Middle East, in countries gripped by tension, trapped in cycles of violence, led by regimes more focused on power than peace. Billions in weapons sold to Saudi Arabia, to Israel, to Egypt, to the UAE. And while those nations receive the tools of war, the profits pour back into US corporations. This is not accidental. It's not coincidental. It's a business model. And for those at the top, war is not tragedy, it's opportunity. But what about the human cost? What about the mothers who hold their children as missiles fall? What about the fathers who bury their sons under scorched soil? What about the refugee camps that swell with each new offensive, with each new bombardment, with each new shipment of American-made arms? Those costs don't show up on balance sheets. They don't affect shareholder meetings. They are written in grief, not in quarterly reports. And this is where the heartbreak deepens, because many of these deals are sold to the public as necessary. We're told it's about protecting freedom, countering terrorism, standing with allies. But behind those slogans is something much colder. It's about keeping factories open, contracts signed, profits rising. And if that means arming authoritarian regimes, turning a blind eye to war crimes, or fueling conflicts that kill civilians by the thousands, so be it. As long as the checks clear, the system continues. And while these corporations grow, communities around the world crumble. Schools are flattened. Hospitals are bombed. Markets become battlefields. Entire cities are reduced to ash. But none of that stops the flow of weapons. In fact, destruction often drives demand. When cities are torn apart, governments need to rebuild their arsenals. More orders, more contracts, more revenue. It becomes a perfect, brutal cycle. And the people caught in the middle are just seen as background noise. Even within the United States, this economy of war leaves scars. It distorts priorities. It steals resources from education, from healthcare, from infrastructure. Entire generations grow up in a country that spends more on foreign wars than on fixing problems at home, while weapons roll off assembly lines, schools close. While bombs are dropped overseas, clean water is still unavailable in parts of America. It's not just about what war costs the world, it's about what it costs all of us, too. And the saddest part, Most people don't even know. They don't know where their tax dollars are going. They don't realize that while they work two jobs to survive, billions are being handed to companies that profit from death. They don't see the meetings behind closed doors where lobbyists and lawmakers decide which country gets weapons next. But they feel the consequences. They feel it when policies are shaped by corporate interests instead of human needs. They feel it when justice takes a backseat to profit. War should never be a business. Human suffering should never be a commodity. And yet, that's what it has become. A calculated economy of destruction, built on pain, sustained by power, and protected by silence. If we ever want to see true peace, we have to break that silence. We have to speak up. We have to demand transparency, accountability, and an end to the practice of treating lives like currency. Because every dollar made from a weapon sold is soaked in the possibility of tragedy. Every contract signed could be the beginning of someone's nightmare. And as long as profit is the motive, peace will always be delayed. It's time we choose differently, not just with our words, but with our priorities, our policies, and our courage. One of the most painful lessons in global politics is this: the very weapons sent to protect can one day become instruments of destruction in the wrong hands. History has shown this time and time again. But somehow the lesson is rarely learned. Governments act with short-term interests, driven by the urgency of conflict or the pressure of diplomacy, and in doing so they often overlook the long-term consequences. The result is a tragic pattern where allies today become threats tomorrow, and the arms once gifted, sold, or strategically supplied are turned around and used to destroy the very ideals they were meant to defend. There's something devastating about watching a weapon manufactured in your own country end up in the hands of the enemy. It feels like betrayal, like failure, like negligence dressed as strategy. But more than anything, it feels like a haunting echo of lives lost due to choices made by people far from the battlefield. This isn't a theory. It's a reality that has unfolded across the Middle East over decades with a body count that continues to rise. Look back at Afghanistan. Billions of dollars were spent training and equipping Afghan security forces, arming them with rifles, vehicles, helicopters, and surveillance equipment. The United States and its allies poured resources into building a force that could supposedly stand on its own. But when the Taliban regained control, much of that equipment was abandoned, seized, or sold. Overnight, a militant group that had been driven into the mountains was now outfitted with American military gear. Sophisticated weapons designed for national defense became tools of fear. Civilians who once fled from Taliban fighters now feared them even more because their firepower had grown, and ironically, it was funded by the very governments that had claimed to protect them. And this isn't just an isolated case. It's a recurring reality. In Iraq, after the fall of Saddam Hussein, US weapons sent to support Iraqi forces against terrorism were captured by ISIS during their rapid territorial expansion. Videos circulated showing American-made tanks, Humvees, and rifles paraded by extremists who had become some of the most feared insurgents in the world. The weaponry intended to defeat terrorism had, in many cases, become its strongest arms. The problem isn't just where the weapons end up. It's who ends up using them and for what purpose. Governments change, alliances shift. Military factions break apart and re-form under different names. What once looked like stability quickly turns to chaos, and the arms provided don't disappear. They're inherited, stolen, or sold on black markets. And in the middle of all this are civilians, people who had no say in the politics but feel every bullet, every blast, every bombing. There's also the issue of internal repression. In some cases, arms sold to, friendly, governments have been used not against outside enemies, but against their own people, protesters, journalists, activists, entire communities. When weapons are handed over without accountability, without oversight, they become tools not just of defense, but of control, silence, and suppression. People demanding rights and dignity are met not with dialogue, but with tear gas, bullets, and tanks purchased through international deals. There's something deeply human about the tragedy here. It's not just that governments miscalculated, it's that real lives are destroyed because of those miscalculations. A child in Yemen doesn't know why a US bomb was dropped on her neighborhood. A father in Syria doesn't understand how an American rifle ended up in the hands of the militia that took his son. A mother in Palestine doesn't care about foreign policy, she only knows her home is gone. And when these moments happen, there's no one standing beside these families to explain the logic behind the deal. No official is there to say, We didn't mean for this to happen. Because the damage is done and intentions don't resurrect the dead. These consequences are not rare. They are consistent. They're part of a system that values short-term power over long-term peace. A system that treats arms deals as diplomatic wins, even when the long-term outcomes include instability, extremism, and endless bloodshed. And yet the system continues because admitting failure would require courage. It would require accountability. It would require change. But the world can't afford to keep repeating the same mistakes. We can't keep arming for convenience and then acting surprised when those weapons turn against us. Every time a gun is handed over, every time a missile is exported, every time a drone is launched, there must be a reckoning, because these tools don't disappear, they live on, and their legacy is often written in the cries of the innocent. The question we need to ask ourselves is simple but urgent. Are we building peace or just delaying violence? Are we empowering allies or creating future adversaries? Are we protecting people or just trading weapons under the disguise of diplomacy? Until we answer those questions with honesty and empathy, the cycle will continue. And the victims of the next war, wherever it may be, will once again pay the price for the weapons we gave out in the name of strategy, without the wisdom to see what could come next. There comes a point in every system built on violence, denial, and profit when the truth can no longer be ignored. That moment is now. After decades of watching wars erupt, lives destroyed, children orphaned, cities leveled, and hope crushed under the weight of steel and smoke, the world is staring directly into the consequences of its choices. And at the heart of it all lies a simple but damning fact: the system of arms deals, foreign military aid, and unchecked warfare has failed the people it was supposed to protect. What's worse, it was never really built to protect them. It was built to protect interests. And that truth demands a reckoning. It is not enough to express regret after the damage is done. It's not enough to hold press conferences after bombs have fallen, to offer statements of concern after weapons end up in the hands of warlords and extremists. Accountability isn't about words, it's about action. It's about ownership. It's about recognizing the part we've played, not just in enabling war, but in designing a world where war has become a normal business model. The people who suffer, those in Yemen, Gaza, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and beyond, deserve more than apologies. They deserve justice. They deserve safety. And they deserve a future where their countries are not used as testing grounds or markets for foreign weapons. For too long, foreign policy has been written behind closed doors, far away from the people who carry the weight of its consequences. Leaders speak of national interest, regional stability, and global security while shaking hands over arms contracts worth billions. Meanwhile, civilians on the ground carry their children through rubble, bury their loved ones, and watch their homes disappear in the name of diplomacy. These are not abstract outcomes. These are real lives, real pain. And behind each deal signed without accountability lies a trail of suffering. What the world needs now isn't more weapons. It needs a complete rethinking of what global leadership looks like. It needs transparency, because people deserve to know where their tax money is going, who their government is arming, and what those arms are being used for. It needs oversight, because companies profiting from war should not be allowed to operate in the shadows, influencing policies without scrutiny or consequences. It needs bold leadership, leadership that doesn't confuse strength with violence, that doesn't measure success by the number of weapons sold, but by the number of lives saved, protected, and given the space to grow. There are still those who defend the current system, who say that arms deals are necessary for defense, for partnerships, for leverage. But how many more years must pass before we admit that this logic has not produced peace? How many more conflicts must spiral out of control before we understand that giving weapons to governments without demanding accountability is not strategy? It is carelessness dressed as policy. If we keep doing what we've always done, we will keep getting the same outcome: destruction. This is not just a political issue, it's a moral one. Because when we fail to demand accountability from those who sell, ship, and authorize the tools of war, we become complicit in the violence that follows. We cannot continue to treat arms sales as routine and then act shocked when those same weapons become the reason for another humanitarian crisis. We cannot ignore the way our systems, our silence, and our priorities contribute to a world where peace always comes second to profit. Change begins with responsibility. It begins with governments refusing to sign deals with regimes that bomb civilians, imprison dissenters, and use foreign weapons to silence their own people. It begins with citizens raising their voices, asking the hard questions, refusing to look away. It begins with whistleblowers, reporters, and human rights workers bringing truth to the surface, even when it's dangerous to do so. And it begins with the uncomfortable realization that for things to get better, we must first face what we've done wrong. But it also begins with hope, because accountability doesn't mean despair, it means the possibility of something better. It means rewriting the rules so that people come first. It means building diplomacy rooted in dialogue, not dominance. It means seeing foreign policy not as a chessboard, but as a map of human lives, cultures, and futures worth preserving. Imagine a world where foreign policy wasn't measured by how many weapons were sold, but by how many children got to grow up without hearing the sound of gunfire. Imagine a world where arms were not sent to gain control, but where aid, education, and empathy were used to build trust. Imagine a world where governments listened not just to military advisors and corporate lobbyists, but to the people whose lives are shaped by these decisions every day. That world is not impossible, but it cannot exist without courage. The courage to say enough. Enough war dressed as strategy. Enough death masked as defense. Enough lies wrapped in flags. The truth is, we don't need more destruction. We need more humanity. We don't need more bombs. We need more bridges. And we don't need more silence. We need voices willing to speak truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be, because the cost of silence is always paid in lives, and we have lost far too many already. There comes a point in every system built on violence, denial, and profit when the truth can no longer be ignored. That moment is now. After decades of watching wars erupt, lives destroyed, children orphaned, cities leveled, and hope crushed under the weight of steel and smoke, the world is staring directly into the consequences of its choices. And at the heart of it all lies a simple but damning fact: the system of arms deals, foreign military aid, and unchecked warfare has failed the people it was supposed to protect. What's worse, it was never really built to protect them. It was built to protect interests. And that truth demands a reckoning. It is not enough to express regret after the damage is done. It's not enough to hold press conferences after bombs have fallen, to offer statements of concern after weapons end up in the hands of warlords and extremists. Accountability isn't about words, it's about action. It's about ownership. It's about recognizing the part we've played, not just in enabling war, but in designing a world where war has become a normal business model. The people who suffer, those in Yemen, Gaza, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and beyond, deserve more than apologies. They deserve justice. They deserve safety. And they deserve a future where their countries are not used as testing grounds or markets for foreign weapons. For too long, foreign policy has been written behind closed doors, far away from the people who carry the weight of its consequences. Leaders speak of national interest, regional stability, and global security while shaking hands over arms contracts worth billions. Meanwhile, civilians on the ground carry their children through rubble, bury their loved ones, and watch their homes disappear in the name of diplomacy. These are not abstract outcomes. These are real lives, real pain. And behind each deal signed without accountability lies a trail of suffering. What the world needs now isn't more weapons. It needs a complete rethinking of what global leadership looks like. It needs transparency, because people deserve to know where their tax money is going, who their government is arming, and what those arms are being used for. It needs oversight, because companies profiting from war should not be allowed to operate in the shadows, influencing policies without scrutiny or consequences. It needs bold leadership. Leadership that doesn't confuse strength with violence, that doesn't measure success by the number of weapons sold, but by the number of lives saved, protected, and given the space to grow. There are still those who defend the current system, who say that arms deals are necessary for defense, for partnerships, for leverage. But how many more years must pass before we admit that this logic has not produced peace? How many more conflicts must spiral out of control before we understand that giving weapons to governments without demanding accountability is not strategy? It is carelessness dressed as policy. If we keep doing what we've always done, we will keep getting the same outcome: destruction. This is not just a political issue, it's a moral one. Because when we fail to demand accountability from those who sell, ship, and authorize the tools of war, we become complicit in the violence that follows. We cannot continue to treat arms sales as routine and then act shocked when those same weapons become the reason for another humanitarian crisis. We cannot ignore the way our systems, our silence, and our priorities contribute to a world where peace always comes second to profit. Change begins with responsibility. It begins with governments refusing to sign deals with regimes that bomb civilians, imprison dissenters, and use foreign weapons to silence their own people. It begins with citizens raising their voices, asking the hard questions, refusing to look away. It begins with whistleblowers, reporters, and human rights workers bringing truth to the surface even when it's dangerous to do so. And it begins with the uncomfortable realization that for things to get better, we must first face what we've done wrong. But it also begins with hope, because accountability doesn't mean despair. It means the possibility of something better. It means rewriting the rules so that people come first. It means building diplomacy rooted in dialogue, not dominance. It means seeing foreign policy not as a chessboard, but as a map of human lives, cultures, and futures worth preserving. Imagine a world where foreign policy wasn't measured by how many weapons were sold, but by how many children got to grow up without hearing the sound of gunfire. Imagine a world where arms were not sent to gain control, but where aid, education, and empathy were used to build trust. Imagine a world where governments listened not just to military advisors and corporate lobbyists, but to the people whose lives are shaped by these decisions every day. That world is not impossible, but it cannot exist without courage. The courage to say enough. Enough war dressed as strategy, enough death masked as defense, enough lies wrapped in flags. The truth is, we don't need more destruction, we need more humanity. We don't need more bombs, we need more bridges. And we don't need more silence, we need voices willing to speak truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be, because the cost of silence is always paid in lives, and we have lost far too many already.